awful lot going for him as a medical man. He was clinically well qualified. He was extremely well thought of among the elite in Yorkshire. And I think perhaps that explains why he had such a prickly sensibility, because he felt that his reputation was intimately involved in the accusations that were being made about the management of the asylum more generally.
Let us establish some facts, Dr. Best. When I sent William Vickers to you, he was in good health. 6 months in your care, and his leg was mortified.
A result, as I've explained, of his illness. When he was released, he was in the beginnings of convalescence.
The man did not even look to have been properly fed.
Better fed than he would have been at home, sir. William Vickers is a pauper. Such people live like animals. Their homes are like hovels. Once afflicted with insanity.
Let us leave William Vickers for the moment. Tell me about the asylum.
Exactly what would you like to know?
Do you restrain your charges with strait waistcoat or irons?
When the occasion arises, for their own safety, and for the safety of others.
Are they allowed visitors?
When I see fit. In my long experience, the condition of the pauper patients is rarely improved by contact with their families.
Do you allow your keepers to strike your charges?
Of course not, sir. Any keeper who ill-treats a patient is instantly dismissed.
What arrangements are made to prevent the pilfering of clothes?
I've come here, sir, to correct a misapprehension, not to be cross-examined. I trained as a physician at the University of Edinburgh. I was physician extraordinary to the forces in Lisbon.
In which case, sir, you will have nothing to fear from the publication of my letter.
Of course, I understand. You're not an independent voice. You care nothing for the truth. You're in conspiracy with Samuel Tuke.
I'm in conspiracy with no one, sir. I know no Samuel Tuke. Now, my letter. Please.
Be warned, Mr. Higgins. I will not be slandered. Not by you, not by anybody else.
Dr. Best's chance remark led Higgins to the man who was to become his greatest ally, Samuel Tuke. As Higgins was to discover, Tuke was waging his own campaign against the York Asylum. Tuke was a Quaker whose family were long established in York as traders in tea and coffee. York families from the Society of Friends, such as the Rowntrees and the Tukes, were famous for both their business acumen and their zeal for social reform.
By the end of the 18th century, a lot of Quakers were involved in mercantile activities, business, and even in early banking. These families became very wealthy. They were unable to spend their money in a lot of the ways in which other wealthy mercantile families would spend their money because of the constraints of the Quaker discipline. You couldn't gamble, you couldn't drink to excess, you couldn't go to plays, you were barred from attending university, you were leading basically a very simple lifestyle. And of course that wealth, combined with the growing evangelicalism of the late 18th century, lay behind a lot of the social endeavours of that period.
The Tukes had already founded several schools in York, but Samuel Tuke's grandfather, William, became involved in the plight of the insane because of a suspicious death at the asylum some 30 years before.
There was cause for public alarm in 1790 when a patient at the York Asylum called Hannah Mills, who was a local Quaker, was unwell. Her family and friends wanted to visit her. They somehow were fobbed off continuously, and then she died. And whether or not she died as a result of mistreatment, suspicion was created that somehow the asylum had something that they wanted to hide. And the consequence of that was that the local Yorkshire Quaker community decided that this was no fit place for mad members of the Quaker society, and therefore an agitation was got up to set up an institution where depressed and maniacal Quakers could go under the supervision of Quakers, and therefore there was a feeling that they would therefore be well looked after.
In 1796, the Tukes opened the York Retreat. Even in the way it looked, it set out to be different from the asylum.
The Quakers were horrified that behind a very formal, elegant, imposing facade of the York Lunatic Asylum, there were horrible abuses going on. And I think they very self-consciously tried to produce a different sort of architecture, a moral architecture, so that they built an asylum that looked like a home. And I think it's that's the guiding principle of the retreat, insofar as they were concerned to have small numbers living as near as possible in a normal domestic routine.
When Higgins visited the retreat, he discovered that the death of Hannah Mills had provoked the Tukes to declare war on the asylum.
The death of Hannah Mills caused great concern in our community. She was young and healthy, and yet after only 2 weeks in the asylum, she was dead. And as they would not tell us how she died, we could only suspect the worst. But without Hannah Mills, my grandfather would not have founded the retreat. And so out of sorrow has come some good. Ever since, we have been keeping an account of other patients at the asylum. Edward Hanson, put in a cell, stripped naked, beaten, forced to attend the calls of nature in the corner, and for a short while to share his cell with a creature who ate his own excrement. John Thurgold, murdered by a fellow patient 10 years ago.
And no one has investigated or pressed charges?
His brother Robert, also apparently murdered 7 years later. And a third brother went missing from the asylum and has not been seen since.
I cannot believe this has gone unchallenged.
Oh yes, Martha Kidd. She suffered a dislocated hip. Best said the billy goat had done it.
The billy goat.
Take it, friend. For 30 years, my grandfather tried to bring the asylum to account. When Best was appointed, we hoped for improvement, but still nothing has changed. The patients are at the mercy of a man who thinks they are as lowly as the animals. It is an obscenity before God and a shame to all humanity.
The social concerns that Friends were involved in at this time sprang ultimately from the concept of the light within, the idea that there was that of God in every man, woman and child. If you look at the late 18th century, Friends, first of all, became very heavily involved in the anti-slavery movement. Again, the idea was central there that the slaves were no different from other human beings. They had the divine spark within them, just as anybody else did. This goes for the work in prisons. Elizabeth Fry, heavily involved in work with prisoners in the early 19th century, again was insisting that prisoners deserved treatment akin to the treatment that you would mete out to anybody else. And so a logical extension of the idea of the light within was the enlightened treatment of the insane, pioneered by Tuke and others. Even though they weren't psychiatrists themselves, they were insisting that people who were mentally ill were members of the worldwide family of human beings.
Initially, the York Retreat did, in fact, try many of the conventional medical treatments of the age. And what Tuke found was that none of them appeared to have any real effect on the underlying condition.